Our scripture lesson is very familiar to you. It begins in the Gospel of Luke at the 10th chapter. I'm not sure what's in your bulletins, but I'm going to start with verse 25 to give you some of the context. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put Jesus to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have answered right. Do this, and you will live." But the lawyer, wishing to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3, Jesus asked, do you think provided neighborliness to the man who fell among the robbers? The lawyer said, "The one who showed mercy on him." Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." This is the word of the Lord. I'm not going to preach to you this morning. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell you a story that I just read to you, and a story that you've heard, 30 or 40 times before. The story of the Good Samaritan, and you're probably wondering why it is that he is asking us to listen to it again. We know the story. And that, you see, is part of the difficulty that I want to address today, because we have heard this story so many times that we think we know it so well that it's gone utterly flat. And one of the things we probably have not thought about is, what did this story sound like to Jesus' actual listeners when he told it the first time? And I want to see if I can tell us this story that way today, because we will hear, among other things, other surprises, the fact that this happens to be an autobiographical story of Jesus himself. Have you ever heard that before? And you will see, as you hear this the way one of Jesus' listeners heard it, how this is so as you think about it from our 21st century perspective. Now, the lead up to this story is absolutely fascinating, but we don't have time this morning to get into it, so we'll just start right with the story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Notice, first of all, that the protagonist, the main character in this story, is nobody. Everybody. Anybody. Just a man. This person who has no identity, no real personhood, no name, has all the action in the story happen to him, but he himself is just a generic person, a prop. So the man who is going down does not tell anybody anything. but the road that he's traveling does. He's going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, as Jesus listeners, your ears perk up. This is one of the most dangerous roads in Palestine. It has been for centuries and continues to be not as bad, but dangerous still. It snakes through the Arabian desert from Jerusalem to Jericho and back again. Sandbanks on either side piled high. Out of sight then is a whole civilization of Bedouin robbers whose livelihood is achieved by preying on unsuspecting travelers on this road and then going back with the goods that they've gotten by beating and killing and robbing these innocent travelers and pilgrims and bragging about their conquests and being successful in their culture because they're such excellent thieves. The Roman general Pompey said that he had to wipe out strongholds of these brigands in and around Jericho. Ibn al-Tayyib, who was an Arab historian, said that that whole road was covered with thieves all of the time. The Crusaders built a fort in between Jericho and Jerusalem to protect the pilgrims during the time of the Crusades as they traveled back and forth. And Wilson Everhard, I think was his last name, wrote in 1857 that a band of pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem with a heavy guard let one of their own fall behind, and he was attacked just as happened in this story, beaten, stripped naked, and left for dead. 1857. This was a very dangerous road, and what a perfect road for Jesus to use to tell this story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, if you're listening, you're thinking, first of all, this was probably a Jew going down that road. And you know what's going to happen to him even before Jesus says it. And then Jesus says, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and left him half dead. Now, he's unconscious, he's naked, he's lying beside the road, and here comes a priest. Now, when I first heard this story, I was absolutely shocked, as I'm sure you were, that the priest went by on the other side of the road. You wouldn't expect that from a priest, would you? But every hearer listening to Jesus would have expected precisely that the priest would have gone by on the other side of the road. First of all, when I first heard this story, and for a long time afterward, I thought that the priest was probably on foot, walking along with his staff, and he had plenty of time to make this decision, but in all probability, he was riding. We don't realize this because Jesus doesn't say it specifically, but remember that priests were very important in Hebrew society, were the aristocrats. And nobody with any sense would go down that road the slowest form of transportation possible. And if this priest could have a mount, he would have one, and so he would in all probability on this road be riding. Furthermore, we know later that the Samaritan who comes along, who is the lowest person in society, has a mount. So it makes sense that Jesus, even though he doesn't say so, is assuming, and his listeners are assuming, that so did the priest. And then there's a sense in which Jesus probably assumed everybody would understand that automatically, kind of the same way that would happen if you said to your wife, I'm going out to get the Sunday paper today, dear, and she said to you, okay, that's fine. Are you going to take the camel? It's understood that the priest was riding. So he didn't have a lot of time. He's going by rather quickly. Second, The priest is a holy person in a religion that is very hidebound and legalistic. His responsibility in setting an example to the flock and in following the law of Moses is to do everything precisely correctly. And there are 623 Mosaic laws that he had to follow. If he failed to follow any one of them, he would become defiled. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. Now, one of his chief responsibilities was he could not ever touch a person of a lower station physically. Now, here he is riding along the road, and he sees this man who's unconscious. Now, there are a couple of ways he can tell whether this man is of a lower station than he is, or most of all, whether he is one of the Hamarits, one of the professions of tax collecting or shepherding or several other professions in the culture that were just sinful by nature. One was by seeing what he was wearing. And we can tell this today. If you're walking along in the mall and somebody in front of you is going along like this and his shorts come down to here and they start right about here, and thank goodness he has a long shirt hanging down or you would see half his behind, and his hat's on backwards with the brim back there, and his hair's sticking out on the side a little bit. From probably a quarter of a mile away, you can say, that's the costume of the typical American teenage male. There were probably 17 different nationalities at Jesus' time in Palestine. All of them, historians say, wore costumes, ethnic costumes that described what they were and where they came from, kind of the way you can tell how important I think I am by the costume I have on today. But the man beside the road was naked, so there was no way to tell that way. Well, okay, another way that they could tell, that the priest could tell, was by how the man spoke. And you can do that, you know. There were 17 different dialects and 24 different languages in Palestine at the time, and every one of them the priest had to know, because he had to know whom he was talking to so that he could follow his rules. And we understand this. I remember I was traveling once with my wife down to Myrtle Beach, and it was the middle of the night, actually about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we had no idea where we were. And we stopped because it was hot to get something to drink, and we went into a little fast food place that was open overnight, got a couple of sodas, got back in the car, took a sip of them, and they tasted like sulfur. So we went back into the establishment, walked in the door, and no sooner did we get in the door than the gal behind the counter said, "Stanks, don't it?" And I said to Jenny, we in Virginia. You can tell by how people talk where they're from. Even we can today. But this man was unconscious. So with all this to try to process, this poor priest, whom we have maligned from pulpits for centuries, had a very difficult decision to make. If he knew who this person was, and he touched the person, and he was dead, and he couldn't tell, then he had defiled himself. If the person was unconscious, and he touched him in his own shadow, he became defiled. If he poured oil on him, the defilement would come up through the oil into the pitcher and defile him. And if he became ritually unclean, if he became ritually impure, he would have to go back to the temple where presumably he just came from, where he led worship and stand with the group that were waiting to be cleansed. And that would be utterly humiliating. And for 2 weeks thereafter, he could not perform any priestly functions and would not be able to feed his family. So, slow-witted as he probably was, I'm sort of a priest, and I'll tell you, I'm a bright guy, but my light bulb doesn't come on the way most light bulbs come on. Mine is like fluorescent. It blinks a few times before it, well, this priest probably was like that, and he couldn't decide what to do. He froze. Have you ever done that? And afterwards said to yourself after you drove by, gee, I wish I'd done something different? Well, that's what happened to the priest. And so he's gone. And here the man still lies. And here comes a Levite, and we can dispense with him quickly. A Levite is an assistant pastor, and I've been an assistant pastor, and I will tell you that the assistant pastor does, if he knows what's good for him, exactly what the pastor does, and the Levite would have seen the priest go by, and if I had been the Levite, I would have done exactly the same thing. Now, as Jesus is telling this story, and we're listening, we expect that the third person who is coming is a Jewish layperson. We've got a priest, we've got a Levite, both from the temple, both from worship services. We are expecting now a Jewish layman, one of the congregation of Israel, who is part of the worship service. And now we're shocked to discover that instead of a Jewish layperson, it's a Samaritan. Now, in order to understand how we feel about this, you have to think of a person that you just can't stand. Honestly, you don't talk about it much, but in your heart of hearts, you don't know how you can ever explain to God how much you dislike this person. In addition, this person probably needs to be someone in your family, because your dislike of this person and the way he or she behaves is also an embarrassment to you. It's a reflection on you. We tend to dislike relatives that we don't like much more than we dislike normal people that we don't like. The Samaritans to the Jews were relatives, so to speak. They were Semitic people just like the Jews. But they did everything wrong. They worshiped on the wrong mountain. They didn't appreciate Jerusalem. They had just, probably within the previous 20 years, wrecked the temple in Jerusalem and spread animal bones all over it. They were hated by the Jews as the sort of cousins that you wanted to keep in the closet. They would have said, had this been out in the West, the only good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan. And here comes this despised, hated Samaritan. And the first thing you think he's going to do, he can see down the road, probably. You do tend to stay within sight of anybody else traveling on this road. He sees the priest going by, and he sees the Levite going by, and you expect him to do the same thing, but he doesn't. This despised Samaritan, lo and behold, he stops. And Jesus says he feels compassion. Now, in fairness to the priest and the Levite, this Samaritan is free to feel compassion. He's got no laws and rules telling him he can't. But he feels that compassion. And he goes to the man who is unconscious and naked. And the scripture says he binds up his wounds. That comes first, before he pours on the oil, which makes no sense. If you bind them up and then pour on the oil, all you do is wet the bandages. Usually pour the oil on first. But here is a theological statement. God will bind up the wounds of Ephraim. This is a spiritual thing that this nasty Samaritan is doing. He binds up the wounds of this man first, and then he pours on oil. And both of these things are absolute waste, because if you're listening to this story, you know, Samaritan's not supposed to have wine. He's not supposed to have oil. He can't have paid the taxes on these things. This is a bad thing he's doing. But he gives what he has, and he takes care of the man, puts him on his horse or camel or whatever it was, takes him into Jericho, to an inn, sets him up there to be healed and made whole, says to the innkeeper, when I come back, I will pay you whatever it costs for you to continue to take care of him until I return. Now, you remember I said in the beginning that this was an autobiographical story of Jesus? The end of the story, we need to change it just a little bit, change the venue so that we can understand it the way the Jews in Jesus' time heard it. He's not a Samaritan anymore. We're going to switch to the Old West. And imagine this. An Indian on horseback comes riding into Dodge City with a cowboy draped over his saddle and 3 arrows in his back. And he says to the innkeeper, I want you to take care of this cowboy. I'll be back later. I'll pay you what it costs to take care of him. Do you think that Indian is going to get out of Dodge alive? This is a story about the last Samaritan any of us will ever need. It's a story about Jesus who gave his life to save us, to heal us, and to make us whole, despised and rejected in his life, revered and honored today because of the sacrifice that he made. In a few moments, we are going to come to his table by his invitation to the most expensive meal we will ever enjoy. But it costs us nothing. We honor him by responding to this invitation today because he invited us in the shape we're in. He overlooked everything and said, come, please come, I love you. So we honor him, but we receive all the blessing. May this blessing be yours, yours,